Marxism and the Philosophy of Man by Adam Schaff. Adam Schaff, born in Lvov, Poland in 1913, studied law and economics in Lvov and in Paris, and philosophy in Poland and the Soviet Union. In 1945, he received his doctor's degree at the Soviet Academy of Science Institute of Philosophy. During his youth, he participated in the Polish underground communist movement and is now a member of the Central Committee of the Polish United Workers' Party. As a philosopher, he specializes in epistemology, and his principal publications in this field are Concept and Word, Problems of the Marxist Theory of Truth, Introduction to Semantics, and Language and Cognition. Adam Schaff has also done research in the methodology of the social sciences in relation to Marxist theory and has published Introduction to the Theory of Marxism, The Rise and Growth of Marxist Philosophy, The Objective Nature of the Laws of History, and A Philosophy of Man. Now to the actual essay. I just should say also, in this, me reading from the Socialist Humanism book, there's a lot of people inside of it that, some of them are quite unsavory, and some of them are just people I don't particularly agree with politically. I don't know if Adam Schaff is one of those figures. I think he was kind of like a chief ideologue of the Polish Communist Party, whatever it was actually called, during its most Stalinistic phase. So just keep that in mind. There is nothing new in the statement that the central problem of socialism, of any socialism, and Marxist socialism in particular, is the problem of man, and with its most essential aspect of creating conditions for man's happiness and full development. For any socialism, whether ancient or modern, utopian or scientific, has its roots in rebellion against social evils, poverty and exploitation, slavery and oppression, and all other sources of human suffering. Any socialism, even if incapable of saying what human happiness is always ready to say what its obstacles are, and to imply in its program ways and means of eliminating the sources of man's misery. Marxist socialism, whose ideological expression is found in Marxism, is no exception to the rule. A product of the age of great social upheavals, Marxism was born out of an intensified auto-reflection on the relationship between the individual and society. When the young Marx first became concerned with the problem of the human individual and the various forms of his alienation in a class society, Marx's thinking already formed part of the great philosophical trends of the age. It was the merit of his genius that, although his point of departure was the same as that of his contemporaries, he could take a different road and go farther than they did. The fact that Marx chose a different way was due, in the field of theory, to a number of reasons, all of which can be reduced to his different idea of the human individual. In any case, a philosophy of man was the cradle of Marxism. The more important attempts at solving the problem of the individual and society can be placed between two extreme approaches, the heteronomous and the autonomous concept of the human individual. The heteronymous concept of the human individual posits the existence of some superhuman forces of which the human individual is the product or emanation, not only in the physical sense, but also and perhaps primarily in the sense of his attitude and behavior, based on a system of values built from outside, from a superhuman world. This is a typically religious approach, and it does not matter whether it refers to a personal God, the absolute idea, fate, etc. An example of this approach is Catholic personalism. The autonomous conception, on the other hand, rejects the existence of any superhuman forces as responsible for the creation, physical and spiritual, of the human individual and his behavior. As a result, it believes in humanism. But there are two opposed varieties of this approach. One of them, exemplified for instance in Sartre's atheistic existentialism, by rejecting heteronomy and constructing its humanistic autonomism, takes as its starting point the individual interpreted as a spiritual monad, a monad of will, conscience, emotion, etc. In an extreme interpretation, it is typical of Leibniz's monad, which, quote, has no windows, end quote. The individual is lonely, isolated, quote, doomed to freedom, or, quote, doomed to choice, and has no help or assistance. It is true that the metaphysical concept of heteronomy, which the modern scientific mind cannot accept without renouncing all its habits of thinking, has been eliminated, but a mere trifle has been lost in the process: society and the bonds that arise within its framework. And it is no wonder that the purely subjectivist and asocial pattern of this type of existentialism has encountered enormous difficulties, for it expects from the modern mind an equally great, although different, sacrifice as its antagonist. Sartre, it is true, looks for a way out and attempts to reconcile existentialism and historical materialism, but without success. The result is that the structure of his doctrine is far from coherent, and its original sin remains. A diametrically opposed approach is provided within the framework of the anti-heteronomous conception, by the attempt to solve the problem based on society and social relations. A typical example of this position is represented by the vulgarized type of Marxism in the form of economic materialism. Here, it is true, we do dissociate ourselves from both the need to look for the help of heteronomous superhuman forces and voluntarist subjectivism, but in exchange, while regaining human society, which has been lost in the existentialist confusion, we in turn lose sight of the individual. From a history maker, a master of his own choices, he becomes a mere product, a statistical average, an executor of historical laws, an executor of historical laws, which are independent of his will. Let me repeat, this is not authentic Marxism. It is only its crude interpretation, understandable as it is because of a psychological reaction, among other things, to the subjectivist or religious misinterpretation of the problem. Nevertheless, such an approach did exist for many years, and we must not overlook it now when trying to arrive at a correct view of the matter. Marxism, at least in the interpretation that regards Marx's development from youth to maturity as a whole, adopts an attitude which is in a sense different from all the above-mentioned conceptions. Rejecting the heteronomous notion of the individual as a metaphysical, Marxism chooses the empirical foundation of radical humanism. Men are makers of their own history, and history discloses to us nothing outside their action. Everything else is speculation. But existentialist metaphysics is rejected by Marxism with equal emphasis as subjectivist voluntarist speculation, which is given an experience. Everything else is speculation. But existentialist metaphysics is rejected by Marxism with equal emphasis on subjectivist, voluntarist speculation. What is given in experience is not individuals, but social individuals. While making history, they are also history's product. In its struggle against subjectivism, Marxism continues Aristotle's old line, man is a zoon politiken. Zoon politiken. I guess that means political animal. But his point of departure is the human individual, not only as a living organism, but as an organism that acts on a plan conceived in its mind, is something separate in its individuality. Thus, Marxism also vigorously opposes those theories which, while rejecting the anti-humanist, heteronymous vision of the individual, run to the other extreme of the equally anti-humanist, asocial vision of this individual, to whom they only concede the passive role of a product, and whom they actually overlook in some abstract idea of society. In investigating the relationships between the individual and society, our point of departure, only an empirical one, is the individual man. He thinks and acts and always cooperates with others within some social framework, but is a distinct individual. When Marx insists that, quote, men create history, end quote, he opposes both those who maintain that history is created by some superhuman forces while man is only their instrument, and also those according to whom history is created, not by actual human individuals, but by some abstract social groups. But when the individual is treated as the starting point of our analysis, we must not forget that his autonomy is only relative autonomy. This is not a mysterious monad of will and consciousness, isolated and deprived of contact with others. This is a social individual, because unable to live without society, he is, since the moment of birth, shaped by society, and is society's product physically and spiritually. The issue is once graphically expressed by Marx when criticizing the narrow scope of Feuerbach's concept of the generic individual. He put forth his own idea of the individual as the entirety of social relations. This was one of Marx's greatest discoveries, and it contained the nucleus of his philosophy of man. But it later resulted in a formal departure from any direct interest in the philosophy of man, which had been so characteristic of Marx in his youth. For if the individual is always social, that is, if he is a product of society which he creates, then he is in a sense dialectically involved in society. And if the problem of his happiness and development is to be interpreted as liberation from unhappiness and barriers to development, then the problem of the individual and of his happiness and full development presents itself to us as a social problem. What will be of decisive importance is not moral self-improvement, the will of the hero as an arbitrary creator of history, or prayers to some supernatural force, but the ability to set in motion those social forces which alone are capable of removing the social barriers to individual happiness. Thus, although we begin with the individual, we are not only aware of the individual's social aspects, but we also perceive the social way in the implementation of individual aims. The philosophy of man here becomes one with historical materialism as a theory of social development and a basis of the practical activity of men. Consequently, the emphasis, particularly with regard to action, is shifted to society and to the material existence shaping society's development. Marx, together with the young Hegelians, began with the problems of the individual. To the young Hegelians, this remained the central point. They thought that the subjective aspect of the individual life could solve the problem of relationships between the individual and society. Marx also remained faithful to this original problem, the conditions of the individual's happiness and full development, but shifted its solution to the social plane. New categories appear: social class and class struggle, social formation and factors of its development, capitalism and socialism, bourgeoisie and proletariat, as the forces shaping society. But the problem of the individual and a philosophy of man are implicit in this new conception. What is more, without them, Marxian socialism loses its supreme sense, since it loses its humanist meaning. And that is why all attempts at splitting Marx's homogeneous theory into his early and mature views, which are alleged to be not only different but opposed, are basically erroneous. This is the case when the only true Marxism is considered to be based on Marx's views in his youth, and when these views are nonchalantly rejected as a survival of idealism or a young man's inconsistent step toward an idea later grasped by a mature man. The young Marxist thinking can only be understood from the viewpoint of its mature shape. For in his own graphic phase, the anatomy of man is a key to the anatomy of the ape, but the mature shape of scientific socialism cannot be understood unless it is conceived as the embodiment of the ideals which Marx cherished from his youth, and unless his scientific analysis is illuminated with socialist humanism. Marx's change is obvious not only in the choice of words, but also in the approach to the question, both theoretical and practical. The numerous alienations and how to overcome them, the problem with which Marx was preoccupied in his youth, assumes the form of struggle against capitalist domination, a struggle which will put an end to class society and with it to exploitation, the state, religion, prejudice, etc., and thus to basic forms of alienation. And this change of approach also means the shifting of emphasis, particularly in the practical struggle for the fulfillment of the desired ends. To ensure individual happiness, the masses are roused. The masses' struggle is only a means to an end, but as long as the struggle goes on, it is the center of attention. This is only normal, for only in this way can the goal be reached. In propaganda, too, the struggle against capitalism gains ever more significance. The ultimate aim is implicitly understood, but what is really absorbing is the actual struggle, on which all efforts have to be concentrated. The problem of the individual was overlooked in the later phase of Marxism for two reasons. The first is of an objective nature, and is connected with the concentration of forces, poor as they were in comparison with the opponent's power, on what was the most important thing at that time, the struggle of the masses. The other reason is of a subjective character and was connected particularly during the rapid growth of the movement and in view of the long struggle facing the movement, with the fact that many of those taking part in the movement began to forget about the difference between the actual aim of the struggle and the ways and means leading to this end. The process, which inevitably led to a debasement of the doctrine, was encouraged by a number of factors. The inadequate training of the leaders in theoretical problems. The process, which inevitably led to a debasement of the doctrine, was encouraged by a number of factors. The inadequate training of the leaders in theoretical problems, which is rather normal in view of the movement's rapid numerical growth. The pressure of current tasks, which tended to postpone matters not immediately connected with the practical requirements of the movement. The fact that the enemy, taking advantage of these difficulties, turned the problem of the individual into an ideological weapon in its struggle against Marxism. The sectarian and dogmatist distortions in ideology, etc. The result was a situation in which the humanist foundations of Marxian socialism were not only forgotten by many honest and devoted working-class revolutionaries, but even began to be considered by them as something alien to the revolutionary struggle. This is all the more astounding since their words sharply contradicted not only the roots of their own activities and devotion, but also what they were actually doing. The reversion of Marxists today to the problems of the philosophy of man is due to at least three concurrent factors. First, there are the objective requirements of the movement that, after seizing power in a number of countries, is now not only confronted with tasks connected with the struggle against the old system, but primarily with the task of creating new ways of life. The problem of the individual will sooner or later make itself felt, even if it was overlooked for some time. Whatever we call it, and in whatever form it presents itself to us, the philosophy of man will force its way through, since with stabilization, when the enemy has been subdued and life is going on, the central problem, how to make people happy, will be of ever greater importance. Victory brings with it new complications and difficulties, partly because the errors committed by the builders of the new life are now visible. These errors have to be corrected, but it is also necessary to analyze their causes and effects, and this, as well as the creation of new forms of individual life, encourages reflection on the philosophy of man. Second, these objective reasons result in greater needs in the field of theory itself. Although in a sense it reflects objective reality, theoretical thinking has a certain degree of autonomy. This is evidenced, among other things, by the tendency to arrive at a rounded philosophical system. The absence of certain elements in the picture of reality is regarded as a serious gap, particularly with the growing importance of some stimuli in the field of practice. It is not a coincidence that modern Marxist theoreticians regard the wants and deficiencies in the field of the theory of values, the philosophy of man, ethics, etc., as an important lack in their theoretical system. But that some 20 years ago, it is not a coincidence that modern Marxist theoreticians regard the wants and deficiencies in the field of the theory of values, the philosophy of man, ethics, etc., as an important lack in their theoretical system. But that some 20 years ago, the same gaps did not give rise to similar doubts, and did not encourage a similar theoretical activity, while today they constitute important incentives, is due to a change in the objective situation and practical requirements. Third, the intensified interest in the philosophy of man must be placed in the context of the new forms and meanings of ideological struggles. Marxists are now increasingly concerned with the philosophy of man, not only because of the pressure of practical needs, and not only because they want to fill in the gaps in the system, but also because they are interested in the ideological struggle. For the philosophy of man has recently become, in the period of great upheavals and the ensuing reflection on the relationships between society and the individual, not only the subject, but also an instrument of this struggle. Political coexistence, enforced as it is by modern warfare techniques, is the only reasonable alternative to global destruction. But while technical development may in international relations make men renounce the use of force, it cannot and does not make them abandon their systems of values and the concepts and ideas of social life based on these systems. So long as these differences remain, conflicts and attempts to gain victory of one's own ideals are inevitable. If it is no longer possible to solve conflicts by the use of armed force, only the possibility of convincing the opponents and the undecided by means of proper arguments remains open. When we say ideological struggle, we mean argumentation against the system of values opposed to ours. In doing this, we must set forth our own system of values and our own ideas. This method of struggle must inevitably gain in importance in conditions of peaceful coexistence. Whether this leads to an ideological rapprochement whether this leads to an ideological rapprochement as well is a different matter. It is an important issue worth separate treatment. In conditions of coexistence, the problem of the philosophy of man become the problem. In the conditions of coexistence, the problems of the philosophy of man become particularly significant, not only theoretically, but also in practice. For what they are primarily concerned with are such issues as the freedom of the human individual, the idea and guarantees of his happiness, his relationship to society, and the consequent problem of moral responsibility, etc. These are problems in which capitalist countries form the strongest barrier between the, quote, man in the street and socialism, which is undoubtedly the result of the, quote, free world's propaganda machinery, but is also largely due to the socialist errors and to their misinterpretation of the situation. These errors are primarily connected with their inability to shift from the 19th century picture of capitalism to its present conditions. Capitalism still exists as a system, but its forms have thoroughly changed, and consequently the ideas of those who live under capitalism have been modified. This is only natural with the rapid technological and economic transformations of the last decades, and in view of the pressures exerted by the socialist world, which forces capitalism to counteract the revolutionary influence of socialism by resorting to proper measures. Unfortunately, in their theoretical analyses, Marxists pay little, if any, attention to this. On the contrary, since the supporters of capitalism say that because of these changes, capitalism has ceased to exist, it is often asserted that nothing has changed in capitalism, and Marxist formulations from a century ago are literally repeated. This is as false as to insist that capitalism no longer exists simply because it has changed. Capitalism still exists, often more cruel and more capable of exploitation than before, but it is a different capitalism. It has different forms of action and functioning. This is precisely why nationalization or planned economy is no longer an anti-socialist bogey for the, quote, man in the street. I guess that's bogey. My father was in a band named Bogey. This is precisely why nationalization or planned economy is no longer an anti-socialist bogey for the man in the street in the capitalist countries, and why this argument is now less often used in official anti-communist propaganda. It is even admitted that socialist economy is capable of considerable results. On the other hand, anti-communist propaganda makes an ever more militant use of the problem of the human individual, his freedom and development, etc. And it must be admitted that this is sometimes a more effective bogey. What is inevitable in this sphere is not only struggle, which is already going on, but also a Marxist offensive, which must be done under the great threat of defeat in ideological struggle. Success in the struggle for the minds and hearts of men in conditions of coexistence, particularly in what is known as the New World, will chiefly depend on the results of economic competition, but not only on this. Of no less importance to men are problems of liberty, especially in the case of the young nations of Asia and Africa. This is true both of national liberty and the freedom of the individual, with all the implications of the philosophy of man. Human choices and attitudes I got messed up. Human choices and attitudes will naturally be affected, first of all, by facts, but not only by facts. What will also be important is how these facts are presented, and much will depend on a theory's ability to support and develop practice. Facts are not only born in a spontaneous way, facts are also consciously shaped and encouraged. Here is a new and different aspect of the philosophy of man, as an element of the ideological struggle and a factor influencing the formation of the practical relations between the individual and society.